Welcome back to the Business Immigration Benchmark. I'm your host, Laura Blanaers. Today I'm here with Sydney Bridger, our community manager, and she does all things related to benchmarking here at WR, specifically leading the Immigration Benchmarking Collective. And today we're chatting about the results from the Q2 survey, Navigating US and Global Compliance. Sydney, thanks for joining us today again.
Hi, Laura. Happy to be back. And I'm back with great news as we just wrapped up our Q2 Navigating US and Global Compliance Benchmarking Survey. It closed last Friday, and I'm happy to report we had 47 people who responded. And what makes this benchmarking survey and all the other benchmarking surveys the Immigration Benchmarking Collective sponsors is that all responses are fielded directly by global mobility, HR, or immigration professionals who are working in-house. So, the data is real. It's something you can bring to your management team to make more strategic decisions. I'm constantly looking for new ideas for the next benchmarking survey and what's to come, but I'm really loving the feedback we got from this Q2 benchmarking survey.
Amazing. Well, let's jump right into it. The Navigating US and Global Compliance Survey was fielded from April 9th through May 9th, 2025. On average, it took our survey respondents 11 minutes. And the data collection is from a direct online survey of HR, immigration, and global professionals. We had 47 respondents with an average of 13 years of experience. The average size program has 436 U.S. foreign nationals under management in these programs, with 200 foreign nationals median. Thank you to the 47 participants of the survey. So there were so many interesting data points, but I want to kick it off with what did the respondents come back and tell us their priorities are for 2025? This is kind of a consistent question you ask at the beginning of every survey. And what was the pulse here for Q2?
Right. So I actually started compiling these results before the survey closed just to get a sense of if the priorities did shift at all. And luckily enough, they didn't actually, because the top priorities that we see from Q1 to Q2 have remained pretty stagnant, I would say. There hasn't been too much shift in the policy themes. But the first and foremost, most important theme is compliance. So navigating immigration tax and labor laws remains a top priority. All of those regulatory shifts, making sure teams are doing regular audits, legal risk mitigation, all of those good things. The second theme is also really important too. So program efficiency and scalability. With everything going on, how are teams streamlining transfers, making their processes better? As programs get bigger, how do you scale it back, or how do you grow with your program? So teams are really getting into the grind there.
Yeah, and I kind of even see that process efficiency can also be connected to compliance. So when there are efficiencies in the data handoff or data collection, you have a more compliant program. So I kind of see those hand in hand. And I know a theme from last year that we saw come up in surveys was cost reduction and, mitigating cost. And I also think now we're not seeing the word sort of cost mitigation, but we're seeing efficiency come up
Yeah.
because, when you're doing compliance, you're not always looking to reduce costs because you're looking to mitigate legal risk. And to do that, you might have to have some proactive legal spend to support the risk mitigation. But process efficiency here is kind of like, I think, the new terminology of
Yeah.
cost reduction.
Right. Right. I couldn't agree more. The third one is also aligned with our Q1 theme. So policy adaptability. So with all of the immigration changes, how do teams stay proactive? How do they plan ahead with real-time updates? Is it possible to plan ahead with the uncertainty? And then also just making sure policies are aligned, right? So standardizing all policy, ensuring consistency, which also leads back to efficiency.
Totally.
Yeah, so a lot of these are all connected. And then last one, employee experience. I mean, we saw that last quarter as well. So people are, nervous, anxious. So, how are leaders in the field minimizing disruption, making people feel comfortable, even though we're uncertain of what's to come, right? So it's navigating all of that, and balancing is difficult, especially for smaller teams. I can't imagine how overwhelming it is right now.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, we've talked about this before that employee support and experience has sort of fallen in the rankings, the power rankings of importance to programs. Obviously, it's still a consideration, but it is interesting that the thought behind employee experience is like well-being and communication, where I think in previous iterations of folks' priorities of employee experience, it was categorized or discussed as, talent acquisition or maintenance of talent. I think, now we're just in a different atmosphere, a different climate, and it is less about the sort of recruitment of employees. It maybe is more about the maintenance, but more
Yeah.
so about like how are we communicating and are we being effective in our communication?
Yeah. And how are we keeping our employees, right? Like, how do we
Yeah.
make sure they remain happy? So, yeah, that is a shift we've seen.
Okay, so I want to talk about the sort of first sort of hard-hitting question of the survey, which is how does your organization track visa and work permit expirations? And what we saw come out of this question was that most organizations are taking a layered approach. And what we mean by that is they're working with counsel to track visa and work expiries, and they're also maybe running their own sort of backup systems in collaboration with counsel to ensure that everyone who needs to be extended is being extended timely and properly. The other sort of piece here that I wanted to sort of couple this with, and again, this is a pretty lengthy survey. I had a few clients who took the survey say it was very sobering in the sense that it really highlighted a lot of like compliance issues and sort of best practices. So it wasn't meant to scare anyone, but I do think it is a sobering one. And that most teams, when we talk about auditing, because this we also talk about auditing like your program, and I think there's a few different ways to think about auditing. So the first is are you timely extending people? And that's going to be a report of like, is everybody that you employ that requires a work permit or sponsorship that the organization is supporting, are they in status and are you filing timely? The second step is the underlying petition accurately reflect their position, location, employment relationship with the company? And that we saw as a very case by case basis for these organizations. And I'm wondering, what opportunities do you see for organizations to have an efficiency in their audit to ensure that the underlying sponsorship reflects the actual employment terms?
Yeah, there's so many different ways that teams, I feel like, are capturing audits, right? So, whether that's a monthly cadence, a quarterly cadence, I feel like this report says 26% annually, 30% monthly. So I don't think they're black or white path, right? Like each program is different in terms of like your program and checking underlying status. So whatever works best for you, but it's also hard if you're a new program, how do you figure out what works best for you? It's kind of experiment. Okay, this went well this year. Maybe we can switch it up. This person flew under the radar, but he didn't pop up in our report. What happened? Because stuff like that does happen, right? Like, no one's perfect, and we're all just trying to make our processes better. So, I don't know. I don't know if I have the best answer for you, Laura, 'cause I don't think there is a black and white way of doing it, but just experimenting for what works best for your program.
Yeah, one idea I had is, depending on the program, because I work with lots of different shapes and sizes of programs. If your program has remote work, if your program has multi entity sponsors, you're going to want to increase the frequency of audits because there's going to be more opportunity for someone to move without reporting. Or maybe they reported at HR, but depending on how your systems talk to each other, that might not reflect back to the immigration team and ultimately reflect an update on an immigration petition. The other thing is I see with companies that have like multi-entity sponsors, they have a little bit more complicated of corporate entities. People might switch between sponsoring entities, and that may also require an amendment. So if you're a program like that, you're going to want to turn up the frequency of your audits. I have programs that are more straightforward where they're always reporting into office because that is how they work these days, back to office, and that there's only one sponsoring entities. So in those situations, I think a yearly audit would be more than sufficient in that there's not that many opportunities for changes to happen without the right stakeholders like learning of those changes, right? Like if someone were all of a sudden going to be employed by a new sponsoring entity, well, that would be a major shift in their sort of corporate structure. And that would be a more thoughtful and more communicated event for the company so that immigration would be packaged into that change.
Right.
So I think, frequency of audits play into like what type and flavor is your immigration program. But also, I think if you have the need for more frequency of audits because of the complications of your program, you're going to want to rely on reports. And so having reliable data in an HR system is going to be really, really key to partnering with immigration. And so that might require more stakeholders within your HR organization to make sure that, the data you're pulling on a quarterly, monthly basis is reliable. So it's sort of some of these things when we talk about compliance requires sort of a rounding up of stakeholders to make it all happen.
I was talking to someone in one of the virtual roundtables recently, and he told me that he couldn't trust the data from his case management system, or it was either that or the HRIS. I can't remember. It might have been case management, but that was concerning that you can't trust the data in the system itself. So just making sure you have trustworthy data, you can pull reports any way you can outsource things, so maybe an automated monthly report, especially if you have a bigger program, that would be super helpful. Yeah, I think it just depends on what types of services you have, your vendor, of course, but that was eye-opening to me because when I was working in-house, if I couldn't trust the data, how do you do your job, right? Like, you need to know when people are expiring, you need to know when to run reports, all of that, so it's tough out there, so just making sure that's good to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think and when we say we don't trust the data, it's like, does he know where it's coming from? Like,
Yeah,
how is the data collected, right? And that you might end up at a point where you have to start from scratch in a sort of full audit and
yeah.
look at everything individually, and then also start the data collection process to make sure that it can be verified and trusted. So that sounds like a big project, but if we're talking about compliance, you got to start somewhere and breaking it up and working with your legal team to sort of make that happen is incredibly necessary. Talking about sort of reliable data is, when we talk about travel and work locations, we asked our respondents in the survey, how does your company monitor travel and work locations to ensure employees remain compliant with immigration laws? So this is more like, maybe short-term assignments, maybe business meetings. How is your company sort of tackling this sort of global movement of employees for business reasons, right? And over half the teams, 53% rely on employees self reporting to monitor immigration compliance. Meaning, are you going into this country for business meetings? Does it qualify for a business visa? Or do they require more sponsorship because of the type and length of activities that they're going to be doing in the foreign country? How do you feel about self reporting being the majority of how organizations are operating?
You're not gonna know, right, everyone who travels. As much as you would love to know every personal trip, every business trip, I think this makes sense because, as an in-house professional, it's okay, people come to you majority of the time reporting that they're traveling. So, this number makes sense to me, although I wish the other numbers were higher, right? So, if you had an automated, travel approval system where you didn't have to worry about it, someone could just submit, like, a case ticket in a system, that'd be great or, location tracking tools. So I think there's room for improvement here, especially in, the new world of technology, AI being incorporated into programs. So yes, I think right now that is the norm for people to self-report, but I'm hoping to see some improvements in that area.
Yeah, I mean, the follow-up questions I have about, the majority of self-reporting, I wonder if there's education behind that
Yeah.
insofar as like training. So if you've got a population of employees that have to travel for work, is there a training about the need to self-report? Is it triggered with how the company repays or pays for the business trip? I know that Audrey and I in an earlier episode talked about some successful programs that like when the person or when the employee that's traveling completes the expense report, there's some sort of like validation that they've done a screening or a reporting. And so I think that that goes hand in hand because, if someone wants to be repaid for their tickets or even like before they book, I
Right.
think there had to be some sort of like check mark about the visa compliance, about the, business travel being approved. And I thought that was like an excellent plan that probably took a lot of time to put together and a
Right.
lot of thought about how to strategically like place all of these pieces and make sure all the stakeholders are involved. But then I think, yeah, self-reporting would be really successful because you've got the bumpers up to sort of make sure that someone's, following the process that's outlined. So hopefully the majority of folks that are in this self-reporting have those types of like programmatic processes in place so that like they know that their self-reporting structure is reliable or as reliable, as it possibly can be. The other piece I thought was super interesting was that 21% of programs don't actively track
Oh, yeah.
this risk. And so I wonder, is the education behind it missing, or do they know that because of what type of travel people are doing, it's always, covered under like a visa waiver or something? So I kind of wonder a little bit behind like if they're not tracking risk, the why behind it. Because,
Yeah.
if the foreign national or the employee traveling, because this could be global anywhere, if they know the risk to both sort of the person, meaning if they're caught with non-compliance in some countries, as Audrey's mentioned on prior episodes, they might not have the ability to re-enter that country anymore. So there's sort of this personal risk. And then the business risk of like, if they're caught for non-compliance, the organization sort of sending someone in a non-compliant way,
Yeah.
can that organization send anyone in the future? So I wonder if that's part of a consideration. So we'll have to dig deeper on those roundtables.
Yeah, some of the qualitative feedback that I saw from this survey too is some teams just don't have a policy in place yet, but they're hoping to implement one. So maybe fairly new and, just joined a program and like, oh, we haven't done this in the past, but we're hoping to implement it. So that's probably a little bit more of the fruit there. But yeah,
Okay.
it's interesting.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
good feedback. That's good feedback. And that, we know when business moves and there's business need, often they're sort of moving and then asking permission and
Yeah.
sometimes compliance after the fact. So there's sometimes folks in our roles that are sort of playing catch up, and
Yeah.
then looking to sort of mitigate risk on a go forward basis, which always is a challenge.
I know we're only human, right? We can only do so many things at once.
Yeah, and that kind of also speaks to, when we ask the question about how often are you updating your immigration policy guidelines to align with regulatory changes, it's almost always reactive is basically what folks said. And that makes sense because the predictive or proactive approach for policy changes, I think is just hard, right? Like I don't know that there's much, value in that. I mean, unless you're proactively changing your policy because of change in business decisions, because of cost reduction efforts, like that makes sense to do proactively. If there's like a talent acquisition or talent maintenance strategy that you're looking to support, obviously proactivity makes a lot of sense. But as far as like predicting policies, you never really know how they're going to shake out. So often it makes sense to have some patience,
Mhm.
see how things play out, and then adjust if needed.
Mhm. If you had a crystal ball, I think everyone would appreciate it. Right?
Well,
They can plan
I'd win the
ahead.
lottery then, and things would be different. Right. The other thing that came out of the survey was definitely that, the US is sort of at the forefront of challenges these days. And that's obvious here given the change in administration with change in policies. I think some of the qualitative data folks were sort of framing it as like change in laws and like the laws haven't changed. And actually that's problematic for a whole nother reason. It's the policies or the adjudication trends that we see when we see a change in administration, leading to unpredictability.
Yeah, long processing times, the increase in RFEs, all of the intricacies that all of these new revisions are creating, it's hard to keep up with. And in terms of program planning, like if the perm processing time is so long, you have to do a labor market test, but the business needs this person to work ASAP. How do you tell the business, like, sorry, I have to explain this whole immigration breakdown, which is part of the job, right? But it's so hard to plan when your processing times makes you feel like you're stuck.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're gonna have to get more and more creative with rotations
Yeah.
abroad these days, given the lengthy perm pathway to green card. And so that's something I know a lot of programs are already pivoting to. You mentioned another thing of like having to sort of explain, like as the in-house professional, having to explain to managers in HR, as part of compliance, as part of if you're relying on self-reporting for like the business traveler visas, education is a huge piece. And that actually was a really interesting feedback we received. So one of the questions here was how often does your company provide immigration compliance training for HR and managers? So, not the HR immigration specialist, the HR generalist or the HR supporting specific departments or various needs. And most teams, 36% do not offer formal immigration compliance for HR and managers. 32% are training reactively, just over a quarter train annually, and around 6% every 2 to 3 years. So there's definitely a gap in training. And I think my biggest takeaway from this survey is like that might be the biggest room for improvement for compliance, because if you have managers supporting employees to stay compliant or report business travel accurately or report changes to their employment, they only know to do that if they're trained. And so, I think working with counsel, working with vendors is really important to sort of help with this lift because it can be a lot and there's changes in policies, there's changes in trends that, I don't know that the HR managers need to appreciate every nuance, but creating the training to sort of mirror the structure and compliance priorities for your organization is really key. And that at a minimum needs to be annually.
Even just like a town hall, and maybe start
Yeah.
the year, or you can get creative with it too. Maybe making, PDF FAQs, putting on your intranet. So yeah, I was surprised by that number because you would think more teams are doing that on a more regular basis. And like you said, even if it's annually, that checks the box. And you don't have to worry about it. And then everyone is more informed, educated, and it gives you a sense of relief. So
Yeah, and even if the training is just like to your point, like pointing them to the
yeah.
SharePoint site where you're updating the resources. Because I know a lot of employees, a lot of managers, and HR like a self-service model that I've got this initial question. And honestly, the majority of those questions can be answered through an initial FAQ. And it would be a huge relief for, I think, the in-house specialists if folks knew where to get those initial questions answered because what they're doing at this point, if they don't have the training or that site doesn't exist, is that immigration in-house specialist is just answering those on a case by case basis, which really can be quite difficult, especially in a turbulent change of administration time.
Mhm, mhm. You don't have to answer every single question. People are rock stars, and I respect them so much, because day to day, it's hard when you're answering all those questions and then prioritizing your projects and everything else you have going on. So, yeah, anything you can do to help yeah, I recommend it.
Well, I feel like we're just scratching the surface with this survey. There is so much more here. And so, if listeners are interested in hearing more about the survey, getting their hands on one, talking about it, where can they go for more information, Sydney?
Yeah, please reach out to me directly if you're interested in any of WR's benchmarking data. I also manage our Immigration Benchmarking Collective, which is a digital community on LinkedIn. We just hit 500 members this morning. I think it's growing. There might be more now, but it's honestly just a community of global mobility, HR, and immigration professionals like yourselves. So, my whole role as community manager is to craft these benchmarking surveys so they benefit you. So please reach out to me directly. I'm currently in the midst of drafting the Q3 benchmarking survey. We have ideas on green cards, immigration program management. There's been a few ideas thrown around. But yeah, thanks so much, Laura. And I'm on LinkedIn. I'm a nerd and I love benchmarking. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me.
Well, thanks for all that you do for us here at WR and for the Immigration Benchmarking Collective. I know you've grown the community, you've grown the respondents. So kudos and congrats and thank you. And Sydney's going to be taking a well deserved time off to go get married. So we won't hear from her. So don't ping her right away. Give her a few weeks off to celebrate and vacation. We hope you have a great time. Congratulations, Sydney, both on an awesome Q2 survey and also on your upcoming marriage.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Laura. Talk soon.